Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Andy Littleton, and I'm sitting across from my friend Eric Deepen. We pastor in Tucson, Arizona at Mission Church and the Village, respectively. And today we had another great email question about mindfulness, the smorgasbord of spiritual practices, especially meditation, mindfulness, how to engage with that.
Yeah, so we gave it our best shot. And even told you what we ate for breakfast.
We even told you what we ate. Aren't you interested?
Yeah. It was a short one, so you don't have to worry. You can get past it real fast.
Enjoy.
All right. Hey, how are you? It's good to see you, Andy.
Good to see you too for in our little world right here for round two of our conversation.
Round two of our conversation. Faith
over second breakfast.
Yeah, what did you have for breakfast today?
I had just a little bowl of cereal with some blueberries.
Oh, nice.
And there was like a 1/4 inch of coffee left in the pot. And I went, well, I guess that's all I'll have. So I threw that in a little tiny mug, took it like a shot, and came over here.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. All I had was a bagel.
Just a bagel.
Some cream cheese.
Yeah. Carb loading for ministry.
Carb loading for ministry, yes. Yeah. It's sadly a bad habit.
Bagels are good.
Yeah.
What's your favorite kind of bagel?
I either like everything or a salt bagel. Depends on the mood.
You're more of the savory bagel.
Yeah, I don't like sweet bagels. I don't really like sweet anything.
Oh, that explains the village.
Yeah. I'm pretty salty.
Yeah. All right. Nice.
My wife, on the other hand, she is a dessert maniac. So and my daughter, they love to bake desserts. So
okay. Yeah, I like both. I like the sweet or salty.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do a little bit of both. So we got an email again.
A really good email.
We got a really good email. So there was a
Daniel
referencing
McConnell.
That's right. There was referencing back to one of the discussions about our stories that kind of referenced the sermon series that we're in at Mission.
Right.
That podcast got Daniel thinking. So why don't you articulate that question as you understand it one more time for everybody so they know.
So the question is, as a follower of Jesus, how do we engage people who are heavily influenced and practicing mindfulness and meditation, really that isn't where Christ doesn't seem to be any part of it?
Yeah, there was a question A and a question B. That was the dialing in of the question in email number 2. The first one was just, which I think I don't mind putting in here too. It's just the kind of vast array of spiritualities. How to engage all that.
The smorgasbord of spirituality.
Smorgasbord.
But mindfulness has become a big thing, and it's found its way into counseling.
Yeah,
and science-based mindfulness is really like learning to be body aware, learning to be in the present, using particular breathing techniques, all that kind of stuff. It has its links back to Buddhism.
I encounter that in a lot of Christian conversations too, where like meetings will be opened with a mindfulness exercise and stuff like that. Which, I mean, honestly, like maybe, I don't know. It doesn't drive me crazy to like calm down, feel my feet touching the floor or whatever.
Yeah, being grounded, those are good things.
I don't think that all of it is what you're saying is tied back to Buddhism. That can like worry some people, like, oh no, this is like a terrible thing. And I would assume that there are layers that you could get into that would begin to move you away from Christ.
Yeah.
But some of those basics could just be like basic human, but you like, I would think that people who weren't in such a fast-moving society would have just done that naturally without even naming it.
It would be built
where you would just sit in your chair and you would just...
You spend a lot more time on the front porch, more time in quiet, probably. Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is in the culture that we live in, where we are people who are constantly in an elevated state of, in freeze or fight or flight kind of thing, that grounding and mindfulness helps you move out of that kind of stage in space. Because when you're in that, your brain shuts down, your survival brain is enacted, and when you're trying to operate in that world, you're not making good choices. You're reacting. You feel threatened. So psychologists and psychiatrists use this. They sometimes in sessions will even have people go out and breathe deeply and put their hand on a tree and feel the tree and be grounded and get them. So that's all part of it. But I think it's become such a trend, and people are caught up in it.
Sure.
And because it has benefits, people think it's the thing you should do.
Yeah.
I think, Buddhism meditation is an escape from corruption. Right? And secular meditation and mindfulness is there to heal. Mm-hmm. So it's symptom fixing.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the issues, is that it fixes the symptom, whereas when you look at Christianity, I love Psalm 1 because it says to meditate on the Word of God.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a filling of your mind.
Versus an emptying.
Right. Yeah. We're told to have the mind of Christ in Philippians 2, to renew our mind, Romans 12:2. So these are all things that
does seem to be one of the core differences, is that in some of those Eastern practices, there's this idea that you can reach a space of emptying yourself of all things, and there seems to be a direct command in Scripture to fill your mind with the things of God, with meditations on God. Even to Sabbath is to fill your mind with thoughts of His goodness and to take in the beauty of His It's to fill, and I think that the emptying that a lot of people do actually is a filling, where what they're doing is taking away distractions to consider things, but not aimed at worship in any way, shape, or form. And so the Christian is believing that we are all worshiping creatures made to worship something, and we ought to rightly direct our worship versus attempting to do nothing and therefore allowing whatever enters in to enter in.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think the if you want to take a look at it from like a psychological perspective, meditation and mindfulness in the Buddhist and secular spaces is a detachment at some level. I think there's some filling, but there's a detachment. Whereas I think Christian meditation and mindfulness, I think mindfulness is in Scripture, maybe not in the way that
have the mind of Christ.
Yeah, these are all things where we're supposed to use our mind to focus, but it's an attachment to God.
Yeah, it
is practices that help us be more aware of who God is, and then attach ourselves to Him and have Him attach Himself to us. Like it's a relation. We're forming relationship. Where I don't see mindfulness or meditation in its secular forms as forming relationship with the living God.
Yeah,
I do see it forming relationships with gurus.
Yes, there's always the guru. This is, and it's rarely ever detached from some person's agenda, it seems. Right. And whether you're following that person on social media, it's always hilarious to me, by the way, and this is in Christian circles too, where all the gurus that are telling you to focus and not be on social media find you on social media and lead you through apps. It's so wild. It isn't it? Anyway, it strikes me. I think, and my wife's trying to do a good thing with this app, but there was just a funny comment where she said, "Hey, for my quiet time, I need to turn the volume up on my phone for a little while. Is that okay?" And just that comment, I was like, "That's so interesting."
Yeah, that is. I think what's interesting, though, when we talk about social media, and I think what people are pushing against, is that if you have one of those apps, it is not geared, it's not algorithmed. You're not looking to post something and get likes. You're not comparing yourself to people. It's still, but the phone is at the center of it. It's an interesting center, yes. It's an interesting idea.
And is it a movement in the right direction? I'd say so.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. It still puts you with your head down and not connected. But I mean, I would argue if you have your Bible in front of you, you still have a thing in front of you.
And it's a technology, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at one point, there was a sincere fear that the devil was in the pages because this machine was, printing out words. And so it's a technology. Yeah.
Yeah. But I hear like, the irony of it all is fascinating.
It's just the irony. Yeah. It wasn't a thing I was like, no, this is terrible.
No,
I just kind of laughed. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, right. Get off of social media, but get onto my app.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I'm, by the way, advertising on social media.
Yeah. Well, right. Exactly.
Yeah, there's some irony to the whole process.
Follow my YouTube channel. Yeah. So I don't think that's really the question, though, to distinguish these things. It's more like there's a hyper spirituality. I mean, we're seeing this at Mission. I'm assuming you are too. Like I keep getting recommended, or people keep recommending podcasts and stuff to me, and there's just a lot.
I recommend podcasts all the time.
Well, but here's the themes of them, and this is like coming from not necessarily Christians.
Okay,
but it's about the meaning crisis, and the there's a new one out about the kind of disintegration of the new atheist movement and how that partially led to the meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And there is and a new renaissance, like that idea that there's a next renaissance coming where like art and experience are going to be central, because of the skepticism about about the narrative that we've lived in out of the last 10, 20 years, right?
So can I say something, and maybe you can help me with this? And I know we do need to end around, and because I think Daniel's question is how do we engage with people in this process? We'll get there. But when we planted the village 2001, so we're doing prep work as early as 1998 to plant a church, and everything that's being said right now, and about the meaning crisis, all that kind of stuff, and everyone's like acting as if it's new stuff.
Yeah, it's on repeat,
and it is, and it's almost verbatim, and people are acting like no one's ever said this before. Yeah. No one was ever thinking these things before. And I'm like, I think we were all saying that 20 years ago. It hasn't changed. The thing that I've noticed that's changed is there was no social media. And there is now social media.
Yeah.
Right? Social media was we were still in 1.0, the static website. So that's, you just read stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, for sure. I think, so our church is about 10 years old, but I did youth ministry starting around similar time to when you were starting your church, but that's different generation. But excuse me as I keep trying not to sneeze.
That's okay.
If my voice goes out, it's because I'm clearing from the microphone. There does seem to be kind of a pendulum swing that happens over the years. I don't think it's new at all. Even to say new renaissance is, well, there was a renaissance, right? And there have been like other mini renaissance, if you will, that have happened in the past. So it's not, I don't think it's to say this is something we've never seen before, but I will say that in the decade I've done church planting, in the last 2 years, there have been far more people not just in the culture curious, but actually showing up to religious services specifically, and entering into open dialogue, whether that's online, or just when I bring up faith to people. I mean, I was in Kansas City last week for a church planting conference, and I noticed all the older leaders who are like 50s are all talking like nobody wants to go to church, and so we have to go to them and start a business and stuff like that. That feels like cutting edge within the church world, but I actually think it's like a decade behind. Because then I'm at a Royals game standing next to some young dudes, and they asked like what I did, and I did, I'm involved in church, and they actually don't have church background, even in Missouri. But we're like, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I've thought about that kind of stuff. there seems to be this openness that has to do with a lot of those like 20-somethings, Gen Z, right? Like at least in our part of the country, but this was Missouri. That kind of surprised me to have that conversation. But they don't have this baggage that we're talking about in missional church circles. That was their parents' story. And they've watched their parents live outside of any kind of structured faith. And there seems to be a new openness to, it's the new rebellion. It's punk rock to go to church, in a way.
And maybe that's right. But when I was going around to churches to raise money,
I
mean, here are the stories I would tell the story about the U of A basketball team at a funeral.
Yeah.
You overhear one of the basketball players leaning over to the other one saying, "Hey, who is Jesus?
Yeah.
I've never heard of this person."
Yeah. Yes.
Right. People that I met at coffee shops that have spent tons of time, never been in a church. Their parents hadn't gone to church. Like, so all the stories that people are telling now, I'm like, wait, well, we were telling those same stories. Like, that's...
Well, and it's partly because we're in Tucson, and I think cities like Portland and Seattle. I mean, I think the coasts, like you would tend to have more. We're further along on that curve.
Yeah. Maybe that's true.
Yeah, I think as far as our society goes, we would have been seeing that. Yeah. I think there's more of it.
Maybe that's the truth, is there's more.
Yeah.
And our thing was just more prophetic about what was coming.
Yeah.
But, that's interesting. The whole what we think about the world and how they think about us is very interesting.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello and welcome to the Waking Up to Grace podcast, where we celebrate and explore the finished work of our Lord, Jesus Christ. The Waking Up to Grace podcast can be found on every major platform. And now, here's Lenny.
Oh, sure, yeah. And then there's all these different nooks and crannies. I think our world, I noticed this the other day. I saw a post from probably would be like a very left-leaning kind of social justice oriented, definitely not Christian source.
Right.
And they were expressing shock that there wasn't as much consensus in their community on politics as they thought, and even within like the ethnicities that they expected.
Right.
So there is this discovery of this lack of consensus, this discovery that we're not coming to the same conclusions. We're all doing our own thing.
Yeah. And
I think that's sinking in a culture like ours, in a post-Christian culture especially, where where there's this heightened discovery. Our political climate leads to reflection on that and so on. But even I think people, I would assume on the right or the left, are saying, hey, when I like speak out against something or whatever, I expect my whole tribe to be with me.
But they're not.
They're not.
No, it's so true.
Yeah.
Well, I think when we started playing The Village, people would ask, well, who is your target? Because in those days, it's like, are you targeting Gen X? You know, what are you targeting the boomers? Like, what kind of church are you doing? Because it's just at the back end of, the seeker-sensitive movement. We're trying to respond to that. And Rod rightly said, like, well, no, we don't have a target. We have a mindset. So we target postmodern minds. And that could be an 80-year-old. That could be a 15-year-old. Like, it's a particular mindset and understanding the world. I think that postmodern mindset has taken over. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't have that mindset anymore.
No, and if anything, it would be
which makes
people
us very tribal in the way, but odd tribal.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is we're dealing with adults who grew up with parents who had that mindset fully formed,
right?
Who actually inherited a bit of it from their parents. It's like third generation postmodernism,
right? At
least, but those kids are reflecting more on what it was like to grow up under that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting.
That's what I think I'm seeing. And there's a deep skepticism about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm hearing surprising things, which are people saying, like, I think I need something that's like anchored historically. And they're not saying that because it's like some deep conviction. They're saying that because they're like, I've never experienced that before. And I'm wondering what it would be like. And they're looking at, so there's one of the, there's a bunch of Gen Z men who are joining the Greek Orthodox Church.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
This is this new interesting fact.
Uh-huh.
And why? Well, it's structured.
Right.
It's ancient. It's everything their parents were not.
Right.
Right? It's the new punk rock.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I think as we just talk about it, I'm like, you know what? I have noticed a change, because when I was talking to 20-somethings 20 years ago, there was interest but resistance.
Yeah.
A great example is yesterday, my roofer, who's got to be, I don't know, like the inspector guy, he's 25, 23. And he's like, oh, yeah, you're a pastor. Like, where's your church? And I tell him, he's like, oh, yeah, I'm really interested. I've been looking for a church. I don't think he ever had been to church. Maybe he has, but he really didn't seem like he had.
I'm having that experience a lot.
That's a very different conversation than the 20-something who sort of wants to interview me, not antagonistically, but not interested in coming to church, just wants to know. And that's the way it used to be.
I am hearing way more, even less interest in like debating and hearing, but just coming to church. And I keep saying this in Christian circles because I feel like, again, we're always behind. And so like in a lot of the Christian circles, even like missional church and so on, people are like, oh, we need to like tear church down. People aren't interested in that. And I'm like, no. That was 10 years ago. Oddly enough, I'm serious.
I think there's a bigger movement. Yeah,
there's a bigger movement and actually the more you feel we've left people wanting who visited because we weren't structured and ancient enough.
Yeah.
Now this is a fad. I'm not saying like it will stay this way,
but I think
it's an interesting, it's an indicator of something. We can learn from this. Yeah.
Well, I think, I've been reading through the book Anxious Generation, which if you haven't read it, you've got
it's on my shelf.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But he begins to, one of the things that, and he's going through the solutions and talking about one of the problems is, he basically argues, well, there are no rituals, we've lost our spirituality, and this is one of the things that holds us together as people. And the way he talks about it, he's like, I'm an atheist, and yet I believe all these things are good for people.
Yes.
And even if you don't follow God or another kind of religion, you need to have like a Sabbath, and you need to have ritual, and you need to have eating together. You need to have all these things that are provided for you by religion itself.
This podcast that I'm talking about that goes into the new atheist movement and the surprising, I should have the title of it. I don't. Reemergence of faith in God or whatever. One of the things the podcast hasn't all been released, but he's saying that the direction he's going is to show that a lot of atheists who have rejected the way of the new atheists, which was Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and that crew, those who looked at that and went, well, that wasn't good, are actually finding more in common with Christians now, even though they're not ready to say, I believe that. But they're saying the practices, the things that they did were best for humans.
Yes.
And some of them are even coming around to going, well, maybe it means I believe in it.
Right.
So now that's the old guard. That's the teachers, right? Uh-huh. Who are having that discussion. So that, in academia, the discussion's always a little further ahead.
Right.
Yeah, it's just interesting.
For good or ill.
For good or ill, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I feel like it's going full circle to people like Smorgasbord, who was a New Testament scholar, didn't believe in the resurrection, really was in the progressive end of Christianity, but believed in the structures.
Yes.
Right? And the historicity of Jesus, but he didn't really, he didn't believe he was God, didn't believe he raised from the dead. Like he had all the ritual, he had sort of the secular belief system and the social psychology of it all. Yeah.
So Anxious Generation, that's Jonathan Haidt, right?
Yes.
And that's an interesting example of here's somebody who's not a Christian, who's on Christian podcasts all the time, finding more affinity with Christians. It's super interesting. Yeah. Now, the other thing that I'm hearing a lot, so there is the younger generation that grew up, and I think they're skeptical of their second generation postmodern parents and the fallout that they experienced there.
Yeah.
and the untethering to anything. But then there's the I am seeing, had a conversation recently with somebody who's in the kind of the latter stages of life, older, and is saying, I did the liberal progressive thing. That was me, all in, and I'm doubting it, and I'm starting to explore there's a similar thing in that generation too, like the parents of Gen Z, or even grandparents sometimes, who are saying, I ran away from a thing to a new thing. It's left me and maybe society in worse shape, and I don't know what to do now, but I know I'm looking for something else.
Interesting. So I will, I guess the one pushback, and I would say the reason that people are saying, hey, we need to, tear down the church and do these things, is that the data is saying that the millennials are all headed back to church.
Yeah.
Whereas like Xers, boomers, they're all just staying flat, and Gen Z is like plummeting data wise. Like statistically, like,
I'm not saying this is like swaths of people.
So what you're saying is, though, there's things in the water that are different than the data is saying. That's
what I'm saying. And so a lot of those, when I'm talking about those Gen Z people who are coming through, they're not people who are going, I'm going to become a member of this church. Right. I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
It's not that.
No, generally curious.
There's a curiosity, there's checking it out, and I want to get into a little more of that in a second. But yeah, I don't think that would lead to a data point of they're going back to church.
Right.
But they're visiting especially structured and ancient churches, it seems.
Yeah, no. So we should end around to the mindfulness thing, because I think the genuine question is, how, as a follower of Jesus, do I interact with people who don't follow Jesus, but who are really all in on the mindfulness meditation thing? And they really, like, what kind of conversations do you have with that person?
Well, let me throw one more thing in on our way to that, just so
we're on the boat, we're paddling, we just hit another rock, we're going this way.
So one of the thinkers I've been paying attention to is Andrew Root, and so his newest book is The Church in the Age of Secular Mysticisms, or something to that effect. And he's kind of following Charles Taylor and unpacking the philosophy of Charles Taylor. But I'm going to really under explain this, but essentially he's saying that the level of secularism that we've reached is one in which there's a new door open to all kinds of spiritual expression and experience, but those are highly individualized, and so everyone's on these like solo quests, and so therefore we're seeing this smorgasbord that was referred to in the email,
right?
And nobody's version is the same. I think if you talk to the Christians in a church like ours, you would realize every one of these Christians is a different type of Christian, even like maybe closer than if they weren't together in this church. But I can't think of one of our people who would say, I hold to the same exact creed. Like, not really. And in the past, there would have been more shared. It might have been
more uniformity,
national or denominational or something.
Right.
But there's a lot of spirituality. But interesting, it's almost as if the polytheism has gone wild, where there's as many gods as there are people.
Right.
And the earth is like full of gods, which it always sort of was.
Yes.
But we're seeing that.
And the Greeks were that way for sure.
The Greeks, but it's even maybe less. You're not even going to build a monument to one,
right?
Because it would just be for you,
right?
Nobody else would worship it,
right? No, that makes sense.
And so in that space, that's challenging because there's a fragmenting that happens in that, like a severe spiritual fragmenting. And you think of the spiritual consequences of that, of like very low, like, so somebody is practicing their faith, and normally you'd go to somebody, the guru or whatever, to get wisdom. Well, it's hard to do that because you're doing your own unique version of everything. And so even the guru can only speak to a third of what you do. or whatever. So that's challenging. It's fracturing. The people within it. He talks a lot about how it's very fragile, and all that. So then as Christians, this is leading into the question. I think the opportunity there is to say, okay, so kind of Paul at Mars Hill moment. I see there are many gods. I see you're very spiritual. This fractured version of it we're doing. You're right to intuit God. You're right to intuit the spirituality. But if this isn't tied to the one true God, and if this isn't tied to a community that practices this with you and really walks with you, like look, because I think the people of our world also look at the fracturing of our culture and see this isn't good, it's not working.
Right.
You say, so you're going to have to walk into something that unifies and brings together and can create a potential to submit to one another and lay your life down for one another. And I think that's the hard sell of Christianity, but I also think it's the needed voice in the midst of it, that there's a knowable God that can be known and shared where you can unify around.
Right.
And so, for instance, at our church in doing this Mark series and encountering Jesus, people want to have spiritual encounters, but we're spending a whole year just talking about encountering Jesus and tying him back to the Old Testament. Sure. And suggesting that like there's a text where you can actually like find this Jesus.
Sure.
And so we're trying to present it in a different way to people who are looking for a spiritual encounter.
Right.
Anyway, I think discussions like that of asking like, so wow, that's how is the spiritual experience going? How long have you been doing this? How does this tie you to other people?
Right.
Is there a community in which like if, just like what you would hope for somebody else who's kind of off the rails, like when you go off the rails, is there a community that can like walk with you and hold you to this? How would you find that?
Right.
I
think those are good questions.
Yeah. Having those kind of discussions becomes very important.
Well, and I think what's interesting is, something I've learned because I have developed carpal tunnel syndrome, and there's a lot of exercises for it, and I do all those. What I've learned as I've been educating myself is that most of the stretches that physical therapists recommend and all the things that you do is all symptom prevention.
Yeah.
But it actually doesn't solve the problem of carpal tunnel.
Yeah.
There is a whole set of other like weightlifting things and things that you have to do to build muscle.
Like fascia and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're working around, and that fixes the problem.
Yes.
And the thing I've always thought about mindfulness and meditation outside of Jesus is as soon as you stop, all your symptoms are coming back.
Yeah.
And so now you are enslaved to mindfulness and you're enslaved to meditation.
Yeah.
Where I don't have to have a prescribed meditation or a prescribed mindfulness to be in relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because it comes through his spirit and it comes through his people, and they're always in a dance with him. So it's always changing. Like I just want to prescribe like this is the way I have to do it. And it revolves around a text that is inspired. But what I think is really fascinating is like your church is going through encounters and they have testimonies, right? You have people coming up I bet you that a majority of those testimonies are not the same. It's not like you get up and tell the same story and everyone's like, oh, we just heard that story last week.
No, they all have their unique little
because
twist,
it's a deep relationship. It's like a relational encounter. It's not a practice that I did that then got me to this special space where now I can be centered and at peace. And I feel a little but if that's the thing, is that we want to feel a little better. And Christianity is like, well, the only way that you're going to even have any hope is to know Jesus.
Yeah.
And there are ways that you can practice to get to know him. Like, just like you don't date somebody and never take them out on a date. Yeah. And you're like, well, I'm dating so-and-so. So there are things you practice. Yeah. But I think that's where I would go. It's like, well, what happens if you just can't do this anymore?
Yeah.
Like, are you enslaved to mindfulness? Are you enslaved to the meditation? Because that's becomes the ruler for you.
Yeah.
So I think that's something to process. I think, if you're talking about the evangelistic part, a lot of listening
Yeah.
And trying to touch in on their longings and what they're really
Yeah.
hoping for is the beginning space of.
I mean, I think I would start with being encouraged that they're thinking about spiritual things.
Yeah.
And so the temptation for some who kind of grew up with a lot of apologetics and stuff is going to be to want to like debunk it and show them the right way. And that, I think, is like a last step that would come after a lot of listening, understanding, and somebody feeling like you're genuinely happy that they're curious about spirituality and that they would sense that you had a spirituality that they were curious about by being in a meaningful relationship.
Yeah.
And I don't mean this has to take forever. I think you can exhibit that in 5 minutes if you need to.
Right.
By just going like, oh, wow, what do you do? I'm unfamiliar with that. Tell me about that. And then they go, well, what about you? And you can share. But I'm not saying 5 minutes is ideal, but my point is it doesn't have to be like a 3-year process.
Right.
But if the main thing is debunking the smorgasbord, good luck.
Yeah, it's hard.
And especially in this time because everybody's doing their own individualistic thing. So even our secular friends are all arguing about the right kind of spirituality. Like, good luck.
Yeah.
You're just another.
And that's the thing. We're in a pluralist place where you have to trust the story of Jesus.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of stories. It used to be a more dominant, like the Judeo-Christian story was the dominant story. It is not.
No. And even within it, I'm trying to say at our church, and I'll bet if you came here, the Judeo-Christian story of the village, if you went and interviewed all these people,
it's different.
It's different.
Yeah, which is the beauty of things. But so the thing that I think is really helpful, and Doug Paget taught me this, but it's when you're with people who are spiritual, what you need to point out, you don't need to debunk what they're saying. You need to point out when they act like Jesus and when they see Jesus. Even if they don't know they're seeing Jesus or acting like Jesus. Just be able to say, you know what, that's a lot like Jesus.
Yeah.
And because it's shocking to people because people, A, don't know much about Jesus, and B, like, they didn't realize they were acting like Jesus.
And that leads to curiosity.
Yeah. And so, like, that's the best place is just to be like, integrate Jesus in a way that's not debate, but actually invites the person to follow him, you know, or acknowledge that they already are following and they didn't even know.
Yeah.
So those are good, especially people who are really into spiritual stuff. Jesus doesn't leave them alone usually.
No, I mean, and a couple of the, so we've, in the like conversions we've seen at Mission, one of them was somebody who is very into New Age spirituality, like deeply, and like that was career for them. And Jesus kind of punctured through that, like repeatedly, cool. And without any of our help. And when our church got to be involved, it was at the very end of the line,
right?
Which was very interesting. And then some of the others have been, I think, people who weren't looking for Jesus, but were open to anything,
right?
And again, Jesus seems
God's a sovereign process.
It really did dawn on me, and this was encouraging, that my role was not to. I haven't really all the conversions that have worked in our circles lately have not been because I got an argument right or explained something. I just, when called upon, got to show up and just answer questions that people already had about Jesus. And then that seemed to be my role. Yeah. It was like God said, "Hey, Andy, you're invited in now to the process I've been doing. You know?
Yeah. Go for it.
Tell them what I've taught you."
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. I like that because there'll always be a mindfulness. There'll always be a meditation. Yeah. There'll always be a worldly spirituality. But if you're a disciple of Jesus and you encounter someone who wants to talk about spiritual things or their spiritual practices, then Jesus is inviting you just to say what you have been taught by him. You don't need any special like way of engaging. You just need to say, okay, what do I know? What has Jesus taught me? And how can I offer that here?
Yep.
In a humble way.
Yep.
Like, I think that's the big part is the humility.
Yep. Yeah, it was Well, yeah, that's probably a good place to stop.
Yeah, no, this is a really fun podcast. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, great
for the question. And I would just say, hey guys, like you want really fun conversations? Send us emails.
Yeah,
it gets us excited to answer and talk about them. So it is faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. We are looking forward to your emails.
That's right. Thanks for tuning in, and yeah, you can email us. Rating us means a lot on all platforms.
Sure.
If you've rated us on one, you can go rate us on another. It
even
makes
better
a huge
if
difference.
you subscribe. $3, $5, or $10 a month. We love it.
Oh, that's right.
Pay for the hosting.
Yep. If you love and appreciate us in this podcast, it turns out there's about 1 million podcasts out there now, so you got to get ratings.
1 million plus, yeah.
1 million plus. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.
All right. You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.